I guess, Renee or Leah, if you want to do the sort of standard introduction, I'll let you do that.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
I want to welcome everyone. And this is our July edition of Get Hired, which is our virtual program designed to help you enter the workforce. Today, we're have Dr. Ryan Sheep. Dr. Sheep is the director of the Communication Lab at the University of Arkansas and Walton College of Business. He's going to provide us with basic interview skills, including the questions interviewer really ask and strategies for answering them. We're going to discuss professionalism for success applied to in-person, phone interviews, or video conferences. So we welcome you. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Renee, for having me. So, like you said, just to give you a quick rundown, Allie, and for those of you who joined in later, things I'm going to talk about today are sort of general executive presence, professionalism, how to think about talking about yourself, because one of the things that oftentimes people struggle with in an interview is that they make it weird. And they make it into something it's not. So how do you talk about yourself in an effective, memorable way? And then how do you sort of construct your responses? So one thing is like, how do you talk about yourself and your experiences? The other part of that is how do you build that into a compelling story? Then I'm going to talk about the types of questions. There's typically 3 types of interview questions. One is more common than the other, so I'm going to kind of dig into that more. And then a strategy for answering any type of interview question, like dead to rights, any type of interview question. Just about the approach I'm going to give you toward in the last part will help you address that. So we've all interviewed before. We've all had jobs, I'm assuming. At the very least, we've all talked about ourselves. So Allie, if I can just hear from you either vocally or in the comments, that's kind of what I have planned for today. But I also want to tailor this to you and to your needs and to other participants' needs, because I know what I'm going to cover, but I don't know if that's going to meet you where you need. So what are you really wanting to get out of this, Allie, really quickly? And if you don't want to respond, that's cool. You can say that too. You're not going to throw me a curveball. Okay, cool. You have a hard time talking about yourself. That's totally understandable. I'm not going to ask you this question of if you've ever been on a first date before. If you've ever had a successful first date before. You're laughing, Leah, I can see this. But that's what an interview is, right? An interview, in some respects, is sort of that same thing. Not in the obvious, like in the obvious sense, it's not. But in that same respect, it's how do I talk about myself with somebody who's a stranger, who may be particularly interested in me? How do I make this less awkward? So it's tricky, but the thing I often tell people is that why do we go on an interview with somebody? Why do we go on a first date with somebody? Why do we agree to meet a friend for lunch? It's because we think that person adds value. It's because we think that person is worth getting to know a little bit more. It's because we think there might be something extra there. So when you go into an interview, I often tell this with people about public speaking, in that people get nervous when they have to publicly speak. For me, it's like you put a microphone in front of me and I just talk. But a lot of people get really nervous. And I think one of the reasons is that they may not practice it. There's that obvious fear of failure that's always there, that nagging voice in the back of your mind saying you don't belong, you don't have what it takes. But I also think that people have an unrealistic expectation of the audience and an unrealistic conception of the audience. So what I mean by that, it's really a fancy way of saying that nobody wants to have an awkward interview. People don't bring you in just out of sympathy or just to see what happens. People bring you into an interview because they think you have something to offer. Like if you are brought in for an interview, you're in the running, right? You may not be the front runner, but you're not at the bottom of the pile either. You're in the running. So that's the first thing. They're not there to quiz you, to make you feel nervous. I've interviewed tons of people, and sometimes it's awkward for me too, or nerve-wracking for me too, because I may have not had time to read to do all the background work and all that. I bring somebody in for an interview because I think there might be a chance that there's something there. I wouldn't ask that in an interview, Allie, where you are in the running, for several reasons. Because one, you don't want to put them sort of on the spot like that. And two, to some people, like for me, I'm a very direct, open, like, even though I was raised in Birmingham, Alabama, like I don't have that, that sort of bless your heart thing going for me. Like I'm very direct. So I would probably tell somebody, it's like, you're in the top 3. Yeah, I wouldn't say that. It's like, we think you've got a shot. For some people that could look a little bit like you're fishing or desperate or insecure, uncertain, like you're wanting validation from the interviewer. And what you really want to do is make them want to talk to you more. Does that help, Allie? Okay, cool. So that's sort of the basic thing about interviewing. If you're in the room, if you're on the phone, if you're in the Zoom call or Teams call or WebEx chat, whatever it is, they're there because they think that you have something there. There's something there. And your job is to just leave them wanting more. Make them want to follow up with a second interview. Make them want to follow up with an offer. That's kind of where we are. Was that helpful, Allie? Does that make sense? And I forgot to add too that if you hear what sounds like a 2-year-old and a 5-year-old and a dog barking and somebody mowing grass outside, is because all 4 of those things are likely to happen. I can't control my environment. I can barely control myself. So just keep that in mind if a distraction comes up, and apologies in advance. So anyway, I'm gonna, if that was useful, I'm gonna go ahead and jump into the screen sharing. I have about 80 slides to go through. I'm joking. I have like 8 slides to go through. And, I'm kind of going to cover that sort of general executive presence, professionalism. A lot of the things I'm going to say are applicable to in-person interviews as well as virtual interviews, okay? So let me go ahead and get this started. And boom. Oh, that was not supposed to be the first slide. So getting hired, virtual and in-person interview best practices. That's kind of what we're going to cover today. I'm going to start with the virtual, but a lot of the things I say virtually are going to be easily transferable to phone or to in-person. And also, as I've changed sort of the way my screen is viewed, I cannot see the chat box anymore. So Renee, Leah, just interrupt me. I'm used to being interrupted with a question. Or Allie, if you want to, open up your mic, that's fine too. So I've done a lot of virtual interviewing before. This semester, we went online only at the end of it. And a lot of my final presentations for my business communication class, obviously, were all online because half of my students were back in Texas already. And we weren't having any classes. So one of the things I told them is to create the environment that puts you in the best light. So the first thing with that is find, if possible, a clean, quiet workplace. Now, I'm not saying you have to clean your room or your office, because I did not today, but I've pushed everything out of the way. And that's important because when you're interviewing with somebody, they don't know you, right? Um, it's like, you know, that's the whole point of the interview, is to get to know you. So you have to sort of put yourself in the light where they're going to want to to get to know you more. Because one thing that's very, very important when you're interviewing, or when you're communicating in general, I would say, is that every time you're communicating, you're doing one of three things. You're either building, maintaining, or diminishing credibility. Two of those are good, one is bad. The dirty close is not going to give you credibility. It might not be the nail in the coffin, but if you add that to an interruption from a toddler, sound you can't control, bad internet, you stumbling on a question, if you add all those things together, that may not make you look the most credible. So control what you can control. At the very least, push it out of the way. The other thing, if you'll look at my desk right there, that is my workspace. So you see how my laptop is, you see how my big screen is, and then you see the reflection of the light in that book poster. That is not how my current setup is. So with that, the light overhead, and it's really weird, and I'm not going to move the computer, the lights are right here. Also, this is not the ideal way to light it, because if you look at it, I have a very bright east-facing window. If this were an interview where you were going to pay me for something, I would have unhooked all my whole rig there, which is no small doing, turned it around to face the bookshelf, and set this whole thing up differently. I would have kind of made it a professional setting. So you want your light not above you and behind you. You want it more like this. Yes, those are cookbooks, which is what I'm doing now. So I've stacked up my laptop to where I am eye view with the camera. That was really weird, but you get what I'm saying. You want to be eye view with the camera. You want to be sitting up. I don't know if you played piano or were forced to take 3 years of piano lessons like I was. Nothing to show for it. Sorry, Mom. But sit like that, towards the front of your seat. You know, you don't want to slouch back like this. You want to lean up and lean in a little bit and make sure there's a little bit of room between you and the camera. The same sort of posture you would sit like you were having coffee with somebody at sort of an impromptu meeting or a lunch meeting, or if you were interviewing with them face to face. You want to have that same sort of posture. And the cool thing about a virtual interview is that you can create the condition. You can actually kind of control more, in that you can control how the lighting is. You can literally control what they see. Is this making sense? So what I do is I stack up my laptop. If you don't have that same sort of setup, if you're, using a phone, that can be, a little tricky. But even if that were the case, if I wanted to use my phone, which is frankly a better camera than my webcam, I would do the same thing. I wouldn't just hold it. I would mount it somewhere, set it up, prop it up to where it's, hitting me at the right angle. Oops, click the wrong button. The other thing that's really important is you can do all of this right, but if you're not wearing pants like Christopher Reeve's nephew or whatever was, just make sure that even though you're setting everything up, that that you do those minor details. So those minor details go a long way towards helping you succeed and putting you in the best light, but also it really just takes one minor detail to sort of derail the interaction, because the GMA hosts, all they talked about for the rest of that clip was the fact that he had everything right, but not pants. So just remember, little things like that matter. And also being sort of fully professional dressed when you're giving a phone interview as well helps and goes a long way. When I was interviewing for jobs, for the job I currently have, I was at the University of Iowa previously, and my first interview was a phone interview, because they're obviously not going to fly me out just as a first pass interview. So what I did, I got in my car in the parking deck because that was the one quiet place I could find at 11 a.m. And I was dressed for work and I did the same sort of thing. Used my hands free, all of that. Got sort of comfortable, had my notes in front of me, those sorts of things. Is this making sense? Is this helpful, Allie? Because I can't see your comments, but I want to make sure I'm not just like droning on stuff you don't care about. So the, okay. All right, cool, good. Now I figured out how to get the chat on my box. All right, so what I have here now is a sort of generic narrative structure. When people think of interviews, a lot of times they think of quiz or questions, or I'm having to talk about myself. Really what they're asking for is a miniature story. So think of it as like, you're the storyteller. You are the expert. Like, if they were to quiz you about yourself, guess who would make 100 every time? You, because nobody else knows you. Nobody else knows why your experiences matter. But the trick I think a lot of people have is that they just start talking and it's like, frankly, logorrhea. It's just like verbal, you know what. And how do we focus that and make it meaningful and impactful? And the way you do it is by following a standard narrative structure. You have a beginning. Well, somebody asked me about a time when I failed. Give a little bit of setup, give a little bit of task, talk about the actions, and then talk about what happened and what I learned and how that can help me contribute. So you want to have that narrative structure. So you want to have a beginning, a little bit of sort of complication, then how you resolved it, and then, the end result, sort of riding off into the sunset. So think about it in terms of story. You're not answering questions. An interview is not a quiz. I'm not there to find out like more about your resume. Like, I've got your resume in front of me. I've probably read it 2 or 3 times. I'm there to learn about you. So think about it as like, how do you tell your story? And how you can do that is by following this tried and true formula. Okay, just looking at the time there. The other way is if you're having trouble, we added a little more here to this diagram. If you're having trouble, like, okay, tell a story. That's great, Ryan. Don't know how to tell a story. One of the things you can talk about is a problem that you faced, how you solved it, and then why that matters going forward. How you faced a conflict, how you resolved a conflict, how you had a customer who was difficult, and then how you made that customer happy, or you had a customer who was difficult, how you got that customer out of the store without wanting to burn it down. Whatever that is, think of it in terms of problem solution, confrontation resolution, and focus less on the details at the beginning and more about what you did to fix it and why it matters. Because I think a lot of times people, like I said, get in trouble with interviews if they just they don't have structure. They're just answering questions. You're not a question answerer as an interviewee. You're a storyteller. Tell me the story of you. What makes you tick? If you can do that, you're gonna be interesting. And the thing to remember too is that interviewers are people too. I know they may not seem like it, but they're people too. So if you can tell a good story, if you can be relatable, be likable, be memorable, all of these things happen with stories. Stories are memory devices, right? Every story I read my kids at the end of the day has a moral. They learn something about the world. Now I could tell my son, don't create false alarms. But I could also tell him the story of Peter and the wolf, and it sticks a little bit more. It's a little bit more interesting. I'm showing him why you don't, yell wolf when there's no wolf there. I could tell him the moral straight out. I'm just going to keep going. Sorry, Allie. But it's the it's the story is what helps us retain that information. You may just keep on going since we're recording this. Okay. I guess she wasn't feeling it. That's okay. The moral is what helps you retain that story. And if you're likable, relatable, all of these things, you're going to be a more interesting candidate. All things being equal, if I have one client or one person who's way more relatable, was able to tell me memorable details, I'm going to be more interested in that candidate. Okay. Next thing, I guess I can turn the chat function off. There are three basic types of interview questions. There's skills-based questions, and what those are, I'm wanting to know about your aptitude and your technical skills. A lot of times, general interviews, you may not get these. You may not get these. Very sensitive mouse. You may not get these sorts of questions unless you're in a technical field, but or in a field where you've had to do practical work, like construction or plumbing or trades. Like these questions are more common in those sorts of fields. So where I'm testing your knowledge. The second one is by far the most common across any industry. It's called a behavioral question. And with those, I'm looking to see more about your attitude, your character, your resiliency, your ability to learn. And the third are situational questions. One, these are kind of like case studies almost. With these, I'm looking for more like, what's your thought process? Can you think on your feet? Can you figure out what it is we do here and put yourself in that mindset and kind of get what we do? So with the skills-based questions, again, well, I'm going to go to some examples real quick. The skills-based questions, the trick with those is don't focus on the past. Focus on what you've done. Like, yeah, I've worked with, I've done plumbing work before. I've worked on these three sorts of things. Here's what I learned most from those projects. And you talk about that because what you've learned most is the transferable skill. Like that's what matters, not just the fact that you've done this, and that, like that you have that transferable skill. With a behavioral question, I'll get to that in a second. With a situational, a lot of times those are tricky because you may not have had that experience before. And the thing you don't want to say is, I don't know, never done that. Because, that makes you seem like somebody who doesn't get it, somebody who's not willing to try or intellectually engage or emotionally engage, neither of which are good. So when you get a question like that, and you don't really know what to do, it's like, don't say, well, I've never experienced that before. They don't need to know that. They don't need to know what you've not done because this is situational. The expectation is that you haven't faced every situation. It's that you have situational thinking skills. So take a second and think, well, based on what I know about you and your company and how you do things, you can ask sort of clarifying questions. You can say, well, when you talk about dissatisfied clients, what's your protocol for that? Or two competing deadlines, can you tell me a little bit more about what these deadlines are? You can get some clarification from them. The other thing you can do is take what you know based on their company and what they value. So the way you would talk about dealing with a dissatisfied client, if you were applying for an Amazon job, or if you were applying for a job at a small grocery store, you would answer those two questions very differently, right? So what do you know about these companies and how they operate? How do they talk about themselves? That might help you answer those situational questions. Make sense? Okay. Now, the STAR method for answering questions. One of the questions on the previous slide was, tell me about a time you failed. And I use that as an example because people hate that question. They hate it. And I think they hate it because they don't get the point of that question. The point of that question isn't about tell me all the bad things you've done. The point of that question isn't what are you not good at? The point of that question is how have you overcome something that went wrong? What have you learned from failure? Can you learn from your mistakes? That's what people are asking with that question. So the way I started that is with the STAR method. STAR is a method of answering questions that you can use for just about any question aside from tell me about yourself or why should you get this job. Those you kind of just have to chit chat. But with any other question, tell me about a time you worked in a team. Tell me about a time you failed. Tell me about a time you resolved conflict in a team. Tell me about a time, you took a leadership role. Tell me about a time where you played a supporting role. All of these sorts of things can be answered with a STAR question, or with a STAR method, I'm sorry. And the S is situation. So with that, it's just paint the picture. And a lot of times people struggle with this section because they go on too long. They just drone on and on and on and provide all this local color that I don't need. So the S is perhaps one of the shortest sections. So with this, in my previous job, I was responsible for customer service and how we sold tickets, blah, blah, blah. 2 sentences. That's it. And then with the task, that's like what you did. What were you responsible for? What were you having to own in this sort of, like, what was your area of responsibility? So with this task, again, 2 sentences. The third one is the action. And this is the most important part. This is the what did you do? So if you notice, we have 2 sentences, 2 sentences. With action, we have 3. Because action is the detail. This is what you did. That's what matters. And then the last one is the result. Whoop. The last one is the result. And the A and the R are the most important, not just because we're in Arkansas, but just because that really gets to like what you did and why it matters. Do you like that? That was good. So with the R, this is what you did to fix it. For a question like, tell me about a time you failed. The A is what went wrong and why. The R is what fixed it. And if you notice that section I have in R, that section I have in red under R, that's really, really important because a lot of times people just tell me the action, the result. What you got to do is take that extra step and tell me why this matters. So I know this lesson will help me succeed at the Walton Arts Center because WAC puts customers first in ways that few places do, which is why this interests me and it seems like a good fit for my skills. And when you end a question like that, they know that they can either follow up with you or go to the next question. There's none of this like, so yeah, next question. Because that's awkward and that's weird. And if there's 2 rules of interviewing and presentation, it's don't be awkward or weird and don't be boring. The way that you can prevent the awkward and weird is how you frame things, your body language, just being engaging. And it's way harder to be engaging on a phone call or on a video chat than it is in person. Because in person, I can get like, the body language, the lean in, all that. But a lot of times on a video call, people are muted, or their videos are muted. You may not get that. So you got to bring extra energy. And that can be hard, but that keeps it from being boring and weird. And those are 2 really important things to not be. And ways to prevent that, again, think in terms of story, because stories are memorable, stories are relatable. If you're telling a story as opposed to some unhinged monologue of facts about you and things you've done, that's good. If you are looking to the camera, smiling, have everything set up, are ending with a bang, like this question does, it helps prevent you from being, kind of weird and coming off as insecure. All right, and then the final slide is pretty much the sort of bringing it all back home. Build or maintain credibility at all times. Adopt storytelling techniques. If you remember one thing from today, those of you who may watch later, remember that when somebody asks you a question in an interview, they're asking you to tell a little story, a story with a point about yourself and your experiences. They're not asking you to answer the question. They're not quizzing you facts about yourself. They want a story. And then the third thing is, be intentional yet authentic with your speech and gestures. I feel like I talk too fast sometimes on video calls and I have to slow myself down. But, part of that is, I'm just a very boisterous talker. The thing that's important is to remember is that, all of us are in Fayetteville right now, which I'm assuming anyway, which has good internet. Like I'm on Ozarks Go fiber. It's amazing. But we all have good internet. A lot of times if you're interviewing with other people, they may be in a more rural area. Their internet might be slower. So you might want to slow it down and talk more of the speed I'm talking right now. And pause a little more at the end of a statement to give them time to understand my turn over, now your turn, but also to let what you said sink in. Because if it's all notes, it's not music, it's just noise. And if it's all rest, it's not music, it's just silence. It takes notes and rest to make music. So don't forget that. The fourth thing is to rehearse several times. The last thing you want to happen is that the first time you are doing this is the time that counts. The good thing about interviews is that you can Google common interview questions. Chances are they're going to ask you those. I interview a lot of people. I rarely, unless it's the sort of first pass, unless it's the invite you to campus, you have to give a presentation. Rarely do I ever deviate from the opening with the question, so tell me about yourself. Tell me about a time you've taken on leadership experience, working with a team, working with other groups on campus. Tell me about a time you failed, and then ending with, so why should we hire you? That's kind of my standard for like a first pass interview. And that's a lot of people's standards. When you get to that second interview, you might have some more specific aspects of like what they do. But you can still probably get a gist of what they're going to ask you on another interview from the first interview. And if it's just a job where you're only going to have one interview, I guarantee you they're going to ask you, they're going to pull from the common bank of interview questions. There's a reason we do that because, many places do that. One, because they're decent questions. Two, because I'm not testing your technical ability. Right? If I were testing your technical ability, then I would have case studies and thought experiments where I would say, how many marbles are in this jar? Because I'd want to see if you could like take a stab at it. I'd want to see your thought process. But most jobs don't do that. Most jobs are trying to play gotcha. Most interviews are just trying to get to know you and see if you're somebody that maybe possibly could work with the people we have here and add something new and contribute in a unique way and add something to the mix that we don't already have. So rehearse several times because that rehearsal will help you show them what it is that you add to the mix, because you're going to be focused on showing that instead of figuring out how to answer this question on the fly, because you'll already have that. That'll be done. And then the final thing, use your resources. I've got my office's website there. No matter where you are in the world, chances are you can access it. And then the library online classes, the Gale library is really good. And LinkedIn Learning, also known as lynda.com, is really, really good too. The LinkedIn, if you like short videos and little quizzes to test your learning, it's a really good place. And then BrainFuse's job now is not something I have a ton of experience with, but it looks like a very sort of boutique niche service that the library has. And of course, Leah or Renee could tell you more about that. But Fayetteville's invested a lot in workforce development, professional development for their citizens in ways that many towns of its size have not. Take advantage of it. Like, you know, if you don't, other people will. And these little, you know, these services, these little things, just like, you know, setting up your lighting, sitting up straight, smiling, framing yourself in the picture where you have a little bit of space above your head and, you know, they can see your hands. Little things go a long way. Little things like prepping and using the resources can be the differentiating factor. And if anything, they're just good practice. So with that said, I know it's just the three of us on here, but if there's anything that you think I should talk about or cover, or that maybe you've heard from other people that, you know, were points of, you know, concern, you know, I can hit a curveball, so throw it.
Oh, right. I have questions that were to me. They're kind of forward, but in the from looking as the as a narrative or a story, I feel like these questions would really be from that angle. So let's say there's something on my review or resume application, you know, that I still get the interview is good. They have a question about my most glowing history in work or my personal. So how would you use that the or storytelling to us, you know, maybe getting fired job or full time or things like that? And then secondly, that is, you know, maybe an older person and a lot of work experience behind you, but maybe you know most recent technology developments or that kind of thing. And the flip side of it, you're a young person, you may have a lot of in that area, but a lot of work experience. How would you frame a narrative to those questions that you might have?
Okay. There was a little bit of static, but correct me if I kind of got your question was. So let's say that you were working for someone, or that you have decent work experience, but unfortunately you were let go, whether it be a layoff or a firing, you know, terminated in some fashion. Was that correct? Like, how do you talk about that? Okay. So the first thing is the pandemic. If that's the case for this, I often say that the housing crisis of 08 to, you know, whenever you want to think that ended, that provided a lot of cover for people to talk about gaps in ways that perhaps was not seen since the 80s. Unless you're in the tech sector, you had the tech bubble in the early aughts. But the pandemic provides a lot of cover for people who've lost their job, if that's the case. If it's not the case, because all you have to say is, well, you know, I mean, the other thing is, like, I don't think I know anybody who doesn't know somebody whose neighbor, friend, colleague hasn't lost a job. So there's a lot, just like there's a lot of grace with regard to interruptions right now. You know, if my toddler busts in here, you know, big deal. People have a lot more grace and understanding now than they would have 5 years ago, because we live in a different world now. Working from home and sort of the falling apart of many service sector jobs and retail jobs, like, that's provided cover. So one, I would say, you know, when the pandemic hit, my company's situation changed, and as a result, I had to pivot and look at new careers or pursue whatever it is. Just don't make a big deal out of it. Like, just own it. Now, at the same time, if you get fired or something like that, don't say, yeah, I got canned. You know, you can just say, that wasn't the best situation for me. So we decided to part ways and just own it. Don't dwell on it. So we decided to part ways, and I'm looking for a place that's a little more whatever, or I'm looking for a place where I can focus on this skill set. That's how I tend to handle it. I tend to be transparent, but I don't tend to sort of pull the curtain back like Oz. So I own what the situation is, but you don't need to see how the sausage is made, to mix metaphors. So that's kind of how I approach that. Now, your other question is one that I hear all the time from students on the younger person side, which is everybody says I need experience, but I can't get a job. Like, everybody says I need experience to get a job, but nobody's willing to give me experience to get a job. And I'm like, I feel you. So what I tell students with that is that at their age, a lot of times people are hiring on potential. I'm not expecting you to have like the sort of CV or resume that, the three of us will have, or that I'm just not expecting that. What I'm expecting is that you're somebody who is dependable, a learner, and has the right mindset. So with that, a lot of times students are like, well, I've only worked at McDonald's. Like, I've only worked at a cash register at McDonald's. Well, you know what? Cash is the most important thing to McDonald's. So they trust you to handle their money, which is literally why they exist. You showed up to work every day. You're dependable. You're hardworking. I worked in a grocery store for 5 years, from 15 to 20, when I was in college, in high school. I started, I progressed through that, all sorts of different levels. I learned a lot in that job. I mean, if you have to work with the general public, you learn a lot. So one thing is with students who may not have like corporate experience, or the sort of experience that the experiences they have matters. It's just how they frame it. So you can talk about, your customer service skills. The things I would say is this kind of what you were getting at, Renee? Oh, she froze on us. Is this kind of what you were asking me about? Like, is this answering your? Okay, good. So, one is sort of like how you frame it. So you can say, when I was working at the grocery store, one of the things I learned was how to anticipate customers' needs. Then I could talk about how to remember how certain people like certain things, or things that certain facts about customers that we saw all the time, or vendors that we saw all the time, and how I built relationships with those people, which were useful for an assistant manager. You can talk about things like that. The other thing is, if you're a student, your schoolwork matters, right? If you can successfully navigate a group project at the University of Arkansas without going crazy, and get a good grade on it, that says a lot about you. It says a lot how you can motivate other people. So thinking less in terms of what someone paid me to do, and think more in terms of what's your volunteer experience, what's your leadership experience, what's your school experience, what's your part-time job, summer work experience. It's about experience and potential. It's not about what are the handful of things people have paid you to do. Now, on the older end, on the older end of the spectrum, if you may not have sort of the tech savvy skills that other people have, what do you have that matters? Focus on that. The other thing is those things like Gale and LinkedIn Learning, or Lynda. I don't know if they've rebranded officially. I think it's like still this Frankenstein of Lynda by LinkedIn Learning. Those are places to sort of figure it out. And the other thing with that is find people to like mentor and help you. If you are not great with Word or email, there are tutorials within the platforms to help you do those. I hate to say people who don't know much about tech to teach yourself tech, but I'm not asking you to like learn how to code in Python, right? Nobody's expecting that if you're an older worker. It's just like, Do you know how to save a file? Do you know how to alter it? Basic stuff like that. There are tutorials for it, both on YouTube, Lynda, or within the software itself. So taking a couple of hours to figure that out is very, very helpful. And the other thing too, if you're a job seeker transitioning to a different field, or if you're maybe coming back to work for the first time, the important thing isn't about the time you weren't in the workforce or what you don't have. The important thing is what you have to offer. And if you keep that in mind, and if you think to yourself, if you do a personal inventory, which is something I really recommend to people, like, what are some keywords that describe you? Think about that. What are some keywords that describe you? And then go from there. What are some skills that you have based on those keywords? And then from that, what are some specific experiences and things you've done that illustrate those skills? Once you start going through some of those thought exercises, that to me is incredibly useful. Because I think a lot of times, for me, like when I graduated grad school, it's a very different experience from a lot of people, but like it took me a couple of years to find a job. It took me a little while to find, like, not a couple of years, but it took me a long while to find like a job where I felt like my skills were really being used. And it's really, really easy to get disheartened when that happens. But I think the thing to remember is that it's a job market. It's not a job chamber of people making decisions and conspiring against you. And it's hard not to take that personal when you're not getting the job you want, or when you have to transition. But again, focusing on like what you have at your core and what deep down that you can do, that will help you keep your confidence up and remind yourself, like, what is your secret ingredient? Like, what's the special sauce that you bring that no one else does? Because at the end of the day, that's what everybody's looking for. In a sea of sameness, what makes you stick out in a positive, productive way? You can show that, you can own that, you can live that, you can talk about that. That's interesting. If you can tell a story about that, that's memorable. And if you can smile while you're doing it and get other people to buy in and nod their heads, that's likable and relatable. And if you can do those 3 or 4 things, you create a good impression. You build your credibility, and they start to see you less as an applicant and more as somebody who could fit in and contribute to their organization.
Thank you.
That was a long answer to a short question, but
no, that's great. No, it's all helpful. And I just want to put a plug in for lynda.com. I love it too.
Oh, I love it too.
I love it.
Yeah.
I have a couple more questions if you don't
Sure.
mind.
No.
Where in preparation for an interview, where would you recommend that people kind of do, I don't know, research in preparation, to learn a little bit more about that company, or that might give them a little bit of an edge or an inside track kind of thing? That's
a great question. First thing is look at how the company talks about themselves. So how does the company portray itself on Twitter, different social media platforms, and advertisements, if that's applicable? The other thing is every company just about has an About Us page. Every company. Read that thing and look through it and figure out, a lot of times I tell people, I'm very old fashioned with this. I like, print that page out, get you a pen. I don't have a highlighter handy. Get you a highlighter. What keywords do you see? Now, you find a job ad you like for that company? Great. Do the same thing. What are some common words that you're seeing? Are they talking about customer experience, or are they talking mostly about technical, like efficiency and how are they portraying themselves? How are they talking about this position and their expectations? What's the overlap? So that for me, I'm a very visual person, so I have to print it out and draw all over it. But that is a very good place to start. How they talk about themselves and the position that you're applying for says a lot about them and what they're into and what they're interesting. That's important. The other thing some people recommend is going on Glassdoor to see what the interview questions that they ask. I am a lot of times wary of that because I think that can bring a false sense of confidence. Like Glassdoor isn't the skeleton key for that company. It's just a couple of people's experiences, right? I would rather people prepare based on what that job ad says, what the company talks about, and sort of really get those common interview questions down. Those are the ways that I would prepare, because you're going to guarantee that no matter who you interview with, they're going to ask you, of course, tell me about yourself, what interests you about the position, leadership experience, time you've worked with a team, time you failed. They're going to ask you those. So if you know sort of the things they value, keywords, you can mention those in your responses. That's a really important thing to do. Oh,
thank you for that.
Yeah.
And I lied. I actually have two more questions now.
No, go ahead.
And like I said, these were questions that were sent into me. So,
Great.
that we just want to kind of touch on the ones that we can.
Oh, of course.
And, you could do a whole session, I think, just on dressing for an interview and presenting yourself. I mean, you touched on that in, how your space looks and how you look on screen. What are questions about clothing, tattoos? Do I need to really, cover things up? I want to be myself, but at the same time, how do I present myself when I'm applying for a particular position?
Right. Well, I mean, the way I would have answered this question a decade ago is very, very different than how I'm going to answer it now. Like, I feel like I'm an oddity because I don't have any tattoos. But so, for me, I'm like, depending on what they are, of course, that's part of it. Also, depending on where you're applying. Like if you're applying to like a very conservative, buttoned up, then maybe think about it. But if you're applying to, I know like applying, I've interviewed tons of people with tattoos, doesn't really bother me. It just doesn't. I mean, it doesn't have like it doesn't have the same meaning that it had years ago. But I will say this, if you're self-conscious about it, maybe think about covering it up just because you're going to be thinking about it, right? At the same time, if you're not, and it's weird to cover it up, don't. Just be like, the last thing you want to do is to do something that's going to prevent like your authentic self from showing, because we will forgive a lot of things, but we will not forgive inauthenticity and people like not being somewhat transparent with us. Just look at what's happened to Volkswagen's market share the past 5 years. Like they had a nice sizable market share and now they're a bunch of liars and you can't give one away. Part of me is like, be authentic. The other is if you're applying to an organization that is very, very conservative, more old-fashioned, then I mean, maybe think about it. But I'm not one of these. If it makes you uncomfortable, do something about it. Otherwise, don't. If you feel like it hurts your chances with the organization, you can ask yourself a couple of questions. Is this organization the fit for you? And then the other, like, if you really want the job, then, don't show your whole hand at once. So there's that. Also, yeah, when it comes to like professionalism, like I thought it would be weird today. Like I often teach in a suit, but I thought it would be weird today if I showed up in a suit. I thought it would also be weird today if I showed up in a Razorbacks t-shirt. So I went business casual. And I think that most of the times with guys, that's like, slacks, not jeans, but slacks. Some people think you can get away with dark jeans, but for an interview, I would probably wear slacks. Bless you. Slacks and a button up. Maybe a sports coat over it. Maybe not. For interviews, I depending on where you're applying, if you want to be a little bit nice, be nice looking. But if you're applying to, a job and you're going to look really weird if you're wearing like a button-up shirt and a tie, then that's going to be weird. And you don't be weird, don't be boring. So, so yeah.
So you want to strike that good balance.
That balance, yeah. And I think business casual for many jobs is that. So like if you're applying for just a general retail job, nobody's going to think it's weird if you're wearing this, because a lot of retailers, you wear something like this, right? I go into Lowe's, it's not unusual for people to be wearing, workers to be wearing like a button-up shirt and jeans or slacks and a t-shirt. Like that's not unusual. So that's why I kind of think business casual is a good mix. But you had another one. You had another question.
I do have one last one. And this one is about thank you notes. Do I send thank you notes, and when, and what do I say in that thank you note?
Okay. I will say this. I've never had anyone get a job for sending a thank you note. I've never had anyone like lose a job by sending a bad thank you note that I can think of. But if everybody else is sending thank you notes and you don't, guess who sticks out? They don't hurt unless you do like a really poor job of it. But they're hard to mess up. So I would say send them. And if somebody's asking when, I always try to get a business card from the people who interview me or their email addresses ahead of time. And I tend to send an email that same day. Now, if if I am like flying or traveling or, in this case where like you fly in, you interview, you fly out, you have a little more leeway. But, or if the interview runs like is a late in the day interview, you might have a little more leeway. I try to do it the day of, and I tend to do it just as an email. And if I do want to go the route of a handwritten thank you note, I try to get it in the mail that day or early the morning thereafter. I personally think an email is standard. What you say in that is you just say, hi so and so, dear so and so, good afternoon so and so. Thank you, thank you for meeting with me today. I enjoyed learning more about the company. And then if there's one thing you talked about with that person, it's like saying, chatted with Leah. Leah, I really enjoyed learning more about the projects you're working on and how they are helping improve workforce development for, the people of Fayetteville. And then that's pretty much it. And say, thank you for your, thank you again for your time. I look forward to hearing from you. All the best. So like just general thank you, one sentence or two about something specific that you talk to with that person. So that's why it's important when you're in a panel interview to try to engage with each person and not just say focus on Renee and ignore Leah and Allie, but to make sure you're kind of bouncing around, because you want to get something from everybody so that when you write those notes that you have a little something to pull from.
Right. Great. Thank you. I could ask you a few more, but we're running out of time.
You can ask me one more. One more?
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So in interviews, you have, your standard questions for the most part that you'll be asked. But what about the dreaded, do you have any questions for us? What are some, beneficial or impactful questions that you should have prepared for that question?
Yeah, I mean, at that point, just run out of the room. No, no. the things I always, there's some ones that I've used in the past that work well. One is, so what's the most challenging aspect of this job? Like, what's the best part of working here? What have you most enjoyed? So you all have worked here for X number of years. What's been some of the, like what makes the Fayetteville Public Library different? Things like that. Give people, what you want to do is get them talking about themselves, because the interview is it's conversational, but it's transactional, and effective communication has to be transactional and relational. Like, you have to build rapport. You're not just exchanging information. So with those questions, it's a chance to really get them talking about themselves, and you can build rapport, because if there's one thing people love to do is talk about themselves. So get them to, so get them talking about like what they like about the job. What are some projects that are coming up that they're particularly interested in? Just try to be engaged, and you can do that. If it's even for like a retail job, so it's like, or a grocery store job. So it's like, what makes X store different from Publix? Well, you don't have Publixes here. Harps, right? Whatever. Like, there's every company, every business has competition and like market differentiators. Like, talk about, like, you can ask questions about that. You can also, some people ask questions about, so what's the typical workday look like? What are the typical, I'm not a huge fan of that question, but some people like that because it gets details. And then when you get those details, you can, oh, tell me more about that. So when you ask, like, have a couple of questions lined up, but really be listening for things they give you and their responses that open up follow-up questions. So if they say, well, we got project A starting here, and then we have project B, it's like, you can say, oh, project B sounds really interesting. I've done something similar. Tell me more about that one. You want it to turn into more of a conversation with those. And that's a key way of giving them a chance to respond, but it's also a key way for you to be the one driving the truck. Because when they're interviewing, they're driving the truck. When you're asking questions, you're driving the truck. And that's a little bit more comfortable place to be.
Okay. Wonderful. Thank you.
Yeah, cool.
Yeah,
well, I enjoyed this.
Me too.
It was great chatting with the three of you, or the two of you now. And I hope this is useful. If people have follow-up questions, like stuff that this doesn't cover, they're welcome to pose questions to you, and you can filter it through me. We'd be happy to continue the conversation.
Okay, thank you. Appreciate that.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Take care, guys.
Thank you for being
See ya.
here.